For Your Eyes Only is one of those cases of the Bond films where it comes off at first to me as a largely forgettable film, but the more I looked at the films in the research for this year, I just I just couldn't help but put it on the list simply because I just think the movie's boring. The pacing is awful. The writing doesn't know whether or not to take it seriously or retain its camp value from Moonraker. And I think, unfortunately, John Glenn was coming in very excited to be directing a Bond film. Like I said before, he was kind of in the same school as director Peter Hunt, where he wanted the tough, gritty Ian Fleming James Bond, whereas the producers and I think Roger were definitely set in their ways when it came to what his Bond had become, which was sort of a sly Bond, sort of not a campy Bond necessarily, but a Bond that would never be seen doing half the things that Ian Fleming would describe, which is why in several scenes he looks deeply uncomfortable doing what Glenn is asking him to do. And, that famous instance where they were locking horns about Bond kicking over the car, or was it just throwing the pin as a little ironic little twist on the scene? This movie just kind of reeks of, well, Moonraker did not work, and it cost us an astronomical sum of money, and people think we've jumped the shark. Now, the attempt to bring it back down to earth, so to speak, was quite a good idea. I think they were trying to go back to the roots, but again, they were so set in their ways at this point that going back to a tougher formula almost seemed sacrosanct. And so, For Your Eyes Only just comes off as a little stodgy. They very much wasted the character of Melina. Carol Bouquet is one of the few decent things about this movie. I just don't think that the writing for the character was all that good. It was very much saved by her and John Glenn relying on her eyes to do most of the talking. And it's not that Roger's bad in this movie. He does get a couple of good laughs, especially as far as young skier BB is concerned. However, his performance feels a little listless. And I think that's the perfect word to describe this movie is it's listless. It had great potential, but it ultimately didn't meet it and didn't really start off the 80s in a good way. Now we're into the truly bad movies, starting with Spectre. Spectre to me seemed like a repeat incident of a film that is coming later on this list, in that the previous film was such a triumph, both at the box office and critical receipts, that the producers and Sam Mendes and Daniel Craig and the writers were probably a little too drunk on the success, and it resulted in Spectre, which both tries to reinvent the wheel, just as For Your Eyes Only did, only the wheel that it chose to install was a very weakly built one, I'm afraid to say. There was so much going into this movie, and it suffers from a erratic pacing. I mean, normally in a Bond film, you would certainly have quiet scenes and then you would have action sequences. But the action sequences, unlike Skyfall, which proved that Sam Mendes could really direct action, these are very choppy sequences. I think they were more interested in presenting a large screen action scene than they were actually trying to figure out what the scene was about. Like, what's the intention? How does this carry over the story? Some of the action sequences tend to stop the story or drag the movie to a halt, which is a really bad thing to do, especially when it comes to James Bond. But Spectre fails more deeply than the surface level. The story doesn't make a ton of sense. Reinventing Blofeld as Bond's bitter former step-sibling, and the ruse of casting Christoph Waltz and then calling him something else when he's so clearly Blofeld was, The Bond movies usually have brilliant marketing teams, but I think they really were asleep at the wheel on this one. There was nobody on Earth who was going to fall for this. And what's worse, Waltz isn't even that good in the movie. The character is so poorly executed, and Waltz just doesn't seem to get a grasp on the character. You know, obviously we've seen him play villainous types in Inglourious Bastards, but we've also seen him play bad villain types in a film like The Green Hornet, which is, unfortunately, I think the pitfall he fell into once again with Blofeld. He just couldn't quite get a handle on Blofeld, and it's a real shame because I was so excited to see that he was going to be a Bond villain. I was like bouncing off the walls. And to see what they ultimately did in his introduction, photographically looks interesting, but it really lacks any kind of punch, any kind of bite. Introduced us to a very controversial element of the Bond canon so far, which is Léa Seydoux, Dr. Madeleine Swan, who, unfortunately, I don't think is a particularly strong Bond girl. She, again, it comes down to weak writing. They had a good foundation for the character, but they just made her a little too... They made her a little too icy, a little too remote for us to care, because these are clearly lines of dialogue and situations where we're clearly meant to emotionally connect with her, and we simply can't. And I really don't blame Léa Seydoux at all. As I've mentioned before, and as people may see, she is a phenomenal actress. She can really nail it, and she's a little bit better in No Time to Die, because I feel like she and the writers finally got a handle on Madeleine and kind of made her... They connected the emotional stakes that they wanted to convey with her skills as an actress and what the character could do. But Spectre is just a utter mess, and it's a confusing experience watching it, and it's deeply frustrating that they tried to make it the Bond cinematic universe. As I've said in many of the chapters of the James Bond films, they were once again, instead of trying to do their own thing and make Bond unique in his own way, they were chasing the trends of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and at the time the announced DC Extended Universe. It was just such a bad choice. I remember watching this and thinking, oh my goodness, you can't be doing this. Don't do this. This is a big mistake. And this isn't like going back to Fleming's books, because this is trying to make the films deeply interconnected. Like, you may have missed it and you may have missed this. There were clues here. It's ridiculous, because Ian Fleming's continuity was far more interesting, I think, than what they've come up with. So Spectre was very disappointing, but it's lower on the list because it's not as disappointing as... what's coming next? Oh God, it's the unholy trinity. Save me. Diamonds are forever. Diamonds are forever. God, if there was a word that I could use to describe this film, it's tacky. I can understand that after the somewhat disappointing performance of On Her Majesty's Secret Service at the box office, that Cubby Broccoli and Harry Saltzman would want to go back and try to capture the magic of Goldfinger and Thunderball. But unfortunately, while there was wit to Goldfinger and there was true wonderful photographic and kind of this epic grandeur of Thunderball, even though Thunderball has kind of slipped down the scale for me, they didn't really look at they took those in the wrong way. With where they had wit, they put in camp, and where they had gorgeous photography, they put in this very flat uninspired desert was in Las Vegas. I don't think Las Vegas was a particularly good choice because it's not terribly exotic. I think it's very glitzy and kind of a sham town. You know, and the writing is just appalling. And I feel really bad saying this about Tom Mankiewicz and Richard Maybaum because they felt like they had so much fun, like they were kids in a candy store, just playing around with James Bond. But unfortunately, it results in some truly painful lines of dialogue and awful characterizations. The Tiffany Case is not a terribly interesting Bond girl. In the first 5 minutes of her appearance, she very much sets up that she's going to be one, and then no, they don't do that.
Here! Shoot him!
Charles Gray is probably the worst Blofeld I've ever seen, which is saying something, considering the film I just talked about. It was such a letdown for me after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, which I think is one of the best Bond films of all. And it began the crisis of faith. That not only the producers, the crew, and even the actors, Sean Connery famously came back for The One and was paid an astronomical sum of money, and you can tell in his performance that he just doesn't care. That he does not care that he's on that set. He's there to collect his money, and thankfully it went to a good cause. But it just showed that the producers were very much lost, and they began to chase a lot of trends. And so when I think of Diamonds Are Forever, I just think I need a drink. The Man with the Golden Gun is terrible. My problem with The Man with the Golden Gun is it is the absolute laziest Bond film ever made, because they didn't give, this is kind of the fault of United Artists, is they didn't give the filmmakers much time in between when they completed Live and Let Die and going into filming Man with the Golden Gun. And it really shows. I mean, even Tom Mankiewicz admitted that he got written out. He wrote himself out on the script because they couldn't quite make everything gel. And he had a really great idea for Scaramanga, which didn't really pan out. And, this is easily Roger Moore at his worst, because even though he had a really good debut in Live and Let Die, here they tried to make him Sean, just as they had done with George Lazenby, in appearance and manner. And Roger Moore just isn't Sean Connery. He cannot pull off the snarky secret agent. He can't pull off the physical brute of James Bond, because he's simply not that physical an actor, as you'll see in the later films. The Bond girls, Mary Goodnight, I still maintain that Mary Goodnight is the flashpoint for cultural perception of the Bond girls. Now, there had been a little bit of criticism before, but I think she created that image of the Bond girls that are simply, that people think they're bimbos, that they're brainless, that they get in the way, they don't help, they're just there to look good in a bikini or less. And I know that it's not fair against Britt Eklund, because she really wanted to be on that set. She loved the character of Mary Goodnight in Fleming's book, which is a little bit better than what we got here. And I know what they were trying to do with her. They were trying to make things fun. Guy Hamilton was trying to inject more humor into the films, and unlike his work in Goldfinger, his work on Diamonds Are Forever and this film lack any real wit to them. There was great wit and sophistication to Goldfinger. These just don't have it. And it also criminally wastes one of the great actors of his generation, Christopher Lee. Scaramanga had the makings of one of the greatest Bond villains of all, and we didn't get it. Or I think of that great moment, or what could have been a great moment, a great example. I think of a great example, which is when he and Bond are at the match, and we've discovered that Andrea is dead thanks to him. He starts to tell an interesting story about his life and kind of his outlook, and we don't really get that key moment of the meeting of the minds, which I think is what Tom Mankiewicz was really going for, but it just doesn't come across. And also, the production design and the cinematography are just dingy. There's this scummy nature to the whole production that I just don't see ever redeeming itself in my eyes. It just looks like it was shot cheaply and quickly, that there was little time to think, which I think there wasn't much, as I've stated before. But Ted Moore is such a good director of photography, and Oswald Morris is such a good director of photography. How did that not work? How did that not gel? And the production design is lazy. Scaramanga goes from this assassin with a flair to just happens to have an evil lair with a gigantic laser for the MacGuffin that nobody cares about because the movie is just so lackadaisically plotted and paced. It takes forever to get anywhere. I can't stand this movie, and I know a lot of people out there like it a lot more than some of the others, but this is just a gigantic F in my book. But not as big as what's about to come next for number one. Better make it a double. And now we've come to the absolute worst James Bond film ever made, Quantum of Solace. This is a perfect combination of all the films that I just talked about. Boring, lazy, disappointing, lack of interesting story material, bad characterizations. This movie has it all. And it also has a lot worse than that. It also has some of the worst editing I've ever seen in a motion picture. It has the worst James Bond song of all time. This movie is just one of those things where Casino Royale was a big deal. It was the first Bond film to reinvent itself after the disappointment of Die Another Day. And it was very well received. And Daniel Craig conquered the haters, and he was seen as a very respectable Bond. There was a lot of things happening against it, which I slightly forgive it for, which is the writers' strike was happening at that time, and they literally could not ask for a better screenplay. And unfortunately, it led to this very confused and messy production, not helped by the fact that Mark Forster wanted things to be deliberately disorienting, which is why the film is cut the way it is. I've seen him do other films that are good. I think he was dead wrong for directing this kind of picture, because the action scenes are so poorly cut. It actually made me slow down the footage and realize that a lot of the scenes are shot very ineptly. And I think they might have been trying to hide the sloppiness behind all these fast cuts, which just made everything worse. And I think it gave the haters that Daniel had just conquered more ammunition that he was not the best James Bond And unfortunately, it took Skyfall to get a little bit of that back. The political overtones could have been much more interesting than they are, and again, poor execution. Every time I watch this film, it's unpleasant to me. Even more so than The Man with the Golden Gun, which was also a very unpleasant movie. This is the definition of disappointing or letdown, or, I hate to say, failure. This was one of the first times I'd ever seen a Bond film and it failed me. Because I love James Bond, and I was so excited to see this, especially after Casino Royale, my favorite Bond film. This is just throw it in the bin and forget about it for me.
I think you're so blinded by inconsolable rage that you don't care who you hurt.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bearing with me for the worst Bond films of all time. Next time, we're going to get into something much, much better, much more fun. So, until then, I'm Jim Crowley. I didn't have nearly enough of these for this one.